Hello, everyone. My name is Allison McFarland, and I'm professor and director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs within the Faculty of Arts at the University of British Columbia. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to acknowledge, in the spirit of reconciliation, that UBC is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam peoples, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Since we're on a virtual platform, I'd like to invite you to reflect upon the Indigenous lands that you are joining us from today as well. A warm welcome to all of you to our first event of the 2022 Phil Lind Initiative Speaker Series, The Future of Media. This is a special one. We've been looking to focus on media for nearly 3 years now and are excited to finally deliver these events to you all. The media, and media generally, is central to everything we do, from how we interact with one another in our daily lives, to how we understand and shape policy and politics, to how we respond to crises like the pandemic and climate change. This series is about the current state and the future of the fourth estate, traditional media and journalism, but also the growing impact of the so-called fifth estate, non-mainstream media and social media. It is not a postmortem of traditional media, but is squarely focused on where we go from here. How do we restore eroded trust? How do we navigate new media and their ability to shift and obscure narratives? Above all, how do we reshape the media landscape to better society? We're going to explore these questions and more throughout this term, from visits starting with Douglas Rushkoff tonight, as well as Soledad O'Brien, Matt Taibbi, Kara Swisher, and Ed Young in the next weeks. Moreover, I'm thrilled to announce that after a brief hiatus, the Lind Initiative graduate course at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs is back, with 12 students having the opportunity to engage directly with our speakers in a small classroom setting. Co-taught by Lind Academic Director, Dr. Justin Alger, and Associate Professor of Journalism and CBC Public Broadcaster, Catherine Gretzinger, the course delves even deeper into the very same topics we'll be discussing with all of you throughout the series. We're here tonight because of the generosity of UBC alumnus Phil Lind, who has made not only this event, but all our previous programming possible. We can't thank Mr. Lind enough for giving us this opportunity to, year after year, bring such esteemed guests to UBC to address our students, staff, faculty, and the broader community. So Phil, on behalf of myself as director of SPPGA, the Lind Initiative staff, and UBC, we thank you for your contribution. As many of you know, Mr. Lind's donation has allowed us to build a platform through which we can hear some of the most prominent US intellectuals on the critical issues of our time. We've been lucky to be able to continue our programming through a global pandemic, but we're also happy to say that we look forward to welcoming audiences back to UBC for in-person programming this term, with the remainder of our events expected to be both in-person and on the UBC Vancouver campus, as well as streamed live. We hope you're looking forward to this discussion as much as we are. Please feel free to tweet along with the event using the hashtag Lind22. We'll be taking audience questions in the later part of the event. We'll be using Zoom's Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions or to upvote a question you'd like to hear asked, but no comments, please. Our moderator this evening, whom you'll be meeting shortly, is Dr. Taylor Owen, the Beaverbrook Chair in Media Ethics and Communications, the founding director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy, and an associate professor in the Maxwell School of Public Policy at McGill University. He is the host of the Big Tech podcast, a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and a fellow at the Public Policy Forum. He previously taught digital media and global affairs at SPPGA here with us and the School of Journalism at UBC. And he happens to be the former academic director of the Phil Lind Initiative. So welcome back, Professor Owen. I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Douglas Rushkoff. A world-renowned philosopher, futurist, and author, Douglas Rushkoff's inspiring books, like his new call to arms, Team Human, documentaries and articles help communities, companies, and governments navigate the tech-augmented landscape ahead. He shows how we put human creativity at the heart of businesses, even as we embrace automation and all the change it ushers in. Mr. Rushkoff has spent his prolific career thinking about how new media and technology are impacting culture, business, and the economy. He has written 15 books and coined concepts such as viral media, social currency, and digital natives. Among his best-selling books are Present Shock, an exploration of our instantaneous always-on culture, Program or Be Programmed, a clarion call for digital literacy, and Throwing the Rocks at the Google Bus, how growth became the enemy of prosperity, a critique of the digital economy and a set of actionable principles for thriving within it, which he'll draw upon tonight. I am thrilled to welcome Douglas Rushkoff to UBC, and I'm now going to turn the spotlight over to him.
Hi, well, thanks for having me, and thanks to Phil Lynn for making this possible. I mean, for me, the fun part was the 2 hours I just spent with the students at BC. I'm often really concerned about the world, particularly when I watch TV or spend too much time online. But spending time with them has really, I'll remember tonight. It restored my faith in some of the possibility of what young people will do with these technologies that many of our generation decided not to. You know, in spite of what it may sound like sometimes, I'm actually an internet and technology enthusiast. I was around in the early 90s when we started really playing with networking technology, and I saw such a tremendous potential for what they could do. I mean, me and my many friends thought that the internet was going to you know, do what the 60s failed to do to American culture, really open us up and connect us in all sorts of ways. And I think I realized that dream was really not going to happen, at least not anytime soon. It was on one morning in it's 2013, October of 2013, I started to get DMs, direct messages on Twitter from people saying, "Did you hear what happened? Did you hear what happened? People are protesting at the Google bus stops. They're lying down in front of the buses, and someone threw a rock and broke a window on a bus." And, you know, what was happening was, you know, Google, it's interesting, Google, which started out as, you know, two Stanford kids in their dorm room, two young internet heroes really coming up with a really clever way of taking down Yahoo. Yahoo was, at the time, Yahoo was the big bad corporation. They were the default search engine really for the internet. And it was a very top-down search engine with, you know, different categories. It was done methodically, like more like a table of contents or an index or something. And these kids came up with a little algorithm that could use links and what people had linked to come up with a search categorization really automatically from the bottom up. And so they were kind of like the heroes of a new, almost decentralized way of looking at the web. Like Google was to Yahoo as whatever people mean by Web 3 is to Web 2, right? It was this new heroic thing. Yet their company got so big, you know, that they, and it was a kind gesture, they decided to start using buses to transport their workers. Everyone wanted to live in San Francisco because it's cool. It's almost like, you know, the Disneyland of the West Coast. You get this great backdrop, but they would take them in buses from the cool place that they slept down to Mountain View, where they actually worked, down in the Google mothership, you know, and it saved pollution because nobody's driving in cars, and you get more work out of them because they're sitting there, you know, with the Wi-Fi on the bus, doing their work on the way down. But the people who lived in those communities in San Francisco, people who had lived there for decades, they couldn't afford to live there anymore because here are all the high-paid engineers of Google and Facebook and Twitter and all those things. They're living there, raising everybody's rent, so no one can live there anymore. And then sort of insult to injury, they were using the public bus stops of people to cart them in private buses down to Mountain View. And not only were the rents in San Francisco higher, but if you lived near in walking distance to one of those bus stops, your rent was even 30% higher than that. So the people who were protesting or throwing rocks at a Google bus were doing it because here this heroic or seemingly heroic corporation that was going to, restore the net to its function as a people's medium was here. It was making the real world a much more difficult place to live. So how could the tremendous growth, the seeming success of a company ultimately rob the real world in which it lived? And that, I was a media theorist and an internet enthusiast, but I needed to really learn economics. I mean, that's how I got my PhD, was to start studying this stuff, digital economics, figure out what went wrong here. How could these companies that were doing the right thing and good things end up kind of destroying the world in which they live, between Google and Uber and Grubhub and Facebook? It's like, how are they all making the world such an awful place? So, I looked back, and I remembered the internet that I knew and loved, and it really didn't have anything to do with business. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, those of us who were interested in pursuing careers in technology or computers, our parents actually worried for us. To tell your parents that you were interested in going into computers was like telling them that you wanted to do Dungeons and Dragons as your career. That's the way people understood computers. Like, what are you thinking? Because those of us who played with computers, at the time, we were starting to see how plastic a whole lot of our reality was. I remember Timothy Leary, the LSD guru, he said that computers, that technology and the internet was one step more powerful than LSD because it changed the way you conceive of the world. And for those of us who were in on early computing, it really was. Everything was shareware, everything was free. To use a computer was to program a computer. They were the same. There wasn't an interface. You were just in there doing the thing. And I remember the first time I used a mainframe computer, the woman in the lab, it was at college, and the woman said, "Oh, that's great. You made a file. Now you get to save it. Do you want to save it as a read-only file or a read-write file?" I'm like, "Well, what do you mean? What's a read-write file?" She's like, "Well, a read-write file means that anybody can edit it or change it." I was like, "Wow. All right, I'll save it as a read-write file." And I left and I started thinking about, I'd been living in a world of read-only files my whole life. Television was read-only. The money in my pocket is read-only. My religion is read-only. What would a read-write world look like? What would it look like if I was participating in the creation of television? What if I could make my own money? What if I could divine my own religion? What would that look like? And that's what the sensibility of early computing was like. And that was the sensibility that so many of us had, that we were about to move into what at the time I was calling a designer reality, a world that we would be building together, that we would start to question the sanctity and solidity and unread-writability of so many things in our world. And the internet was really sexy and exciting because of that. Everybody was developing stuff. And when you made a program or a platform, a piece of software, nobody thought about selling it. You gave it away because the sign of your success was that people wanted to use it, that you were helping other people figure out something more. We were kind of building this big community, this commons together. But it was exciting. And while at first people thought it was gonna putter out, I remember I wrote my first book about internet culture. It was called Siberia in 1992. And the publisher canceled it because they thought the internet would be over by 1993 when the book was supposed to come out. I mean, that's how little faith people had in the possibility of an internet. But eventually, big business came around and saw that, there might be something here. AT&T was actually offered the internet for like $50 back in the early days when the government couldn't really handle the managing the technology. At AT&T, they turned it down. They could have had the internet. They turned it down because no one could see a way to make money with this thing. But then, Wired magazine came around in late '93. It was an interesting moment. Wired magazine really recast the internet from this weird countercultural designer reality thing that hippies and psychedelics people and long hairs and all were out programming, and decided, no, this is actually a business opportunity, that somehow the internet is going to be able to save the sort of the dying NASDAQ stock exchange. That was a biotech boom and bust in 1987. And no one thought NASDAQ would come back. And this was, Wired said, no. If you read our pages and hire the consultants who are writing for us, you can survive they called it the tsunami of digital technology that was going to come. And the internet went from being this space of infinite possibility to really increased probability. The idea wasn't really to unleash people's creative potential. It was to predict what they were going to do. Because once there's money betting on internet companies, you're not really interested in wild possibilities. What you're interested, once you're betting, is increasing the probability, right, of your money paying something back. And I'm not saying money's filthy lucre, we can't make money and all, but money used in this way was really, it was shackling to development. The internet became about what they called stickiness, and they decided we lived in an attention economy. They called, this was back in the early 90s, an attention economy, because the idea was that the real estate online is infinite, but the eyeball hours, that was the metric that was used, the eyeball hours that a human being could spend looking at your content on screen, that was limited. So we were going to have to now compete for those eyeball hours. And it blew up. There was the dot-com boom and the bust, then another boom of social media. And it got to the point, and I remember just a few years after that Google bust thing, when Twitter went public, Twitter, the messaging app. And I saw this old friend of mine from Blogger, Evan Williams, one of the founders of Twitter. I saw him on the cover of the Wall Street Journal with the number 4.3 billion under his face. And that was the amount of money he had earned that day by the company having its IPO. And I thought, oh man, this guy is screwed. Right? I didn't think, oh, wow, yay, my friend got $4.3 billion. I thought, no, how is he going to deliver 100x returns, 100 times returns, what Wall Street's expecting on $4.3 billion? And within a couple of years later, even now, Twitter was making $2 billion a year. They were making $2 billion a year. And the Wall Street Journal was then calling Twitter an abject failure because it had seemed to peak at about $2 billion. I mean, imagine going to your grandma, oh, I made an app that people send 20 character, 30 character messages to each other on their phones, and I make $2 billion a year, but it's a failure. I mean, how much money do you think one can make on a 30 character messaging app? How much, and why is it not okay to stop at $2 billion? And the reason it's not is because for all of their programming prowess, all of their open source ideas and abilities and digital internet revolutionary ideas, they still don't recognize the underlying operating system, the operating system underlying all their businesses, which is a really old form of corporate capitalism. And that's really what I had to go figure out. What's wrong with the internet is not some new thing. It's actually this weird, how does it make money? So you look at anything, and I decided I'm going to apply the digital lens of a media theorist to money itself, to capitalism, to corporations. And what I found out was that both corporations and central currency were invented at a very particular moment in history. So anyway, so I looked back and found out that corporations and central currency were invented at a very particular moment in time. That in a way, like the early internet, the late medieval Europe was kind of a peer-to-peer free-for-all. They had just opened up all these trade routes after the Crusades and came back with all these weird new inventions and technologies and even forms of business that they had learned from the Moors. And one of them was called the bazaar, which we interpreted as the marketplace. And instead of just working for a feudal lord and bringing your stuff to him, people started bringing their stuff to the marketplace and trading in a peer-to-peer fashion. And they invented this form of money, or actually borrowed this. It was called market money. That was, I don't need to go into the details here, but it was almost like poker chips. It was issued in the morning, and you'd use it to do all your trading, and you'd account for it at the end of the day, and then it would be worth nothing at the end of the day. So it was money that was really optimized for trade. It was just a way of keeping track of who was giving what to whom. And people got wealthy in that period of time. You could really successfully argue that that was the greatest period of organic distributed growth that we've seen really in human history. People were getting wealthy. They were working 3 or 4 days a week. Women were taller at any then than at any moment in history until the 1980s. Women finally caught up in Europe with how healthy women were at that period of time. But the problem with this economy, this peer-to-peer market economy, was that as the peasants were becoming the new middle class, the aristocracy was getting poor. So they really put curbs on the whole thing. They invented 2 things to prevent this market from replacing them. You know, the first thing they came up with was the chartered monopoly. So now you weren't allowed to have your own business. The idea of a chartered monopoly is if, you know, Joe and Mike and Pete and Mary all made shoes independently. Now the king would pick one of them to be his official shoe merchant, you know, his Majesty's royal cobbler, and anyone else who wanted to be in the shoe business would have to be an employee for that person. So now, instead of making shoes and selling them for money, now you're working for a shoemaker, right? You're working for a shoe company, and you're selling your time instead of the value you create. That's the moment they put, I mean, it's a great media theory tidbit. That's the moment they put the clock tower on the highest building in the town. It was because they needed a way to show that each hour is fair, and you know when your day of work is done. And the second great invention they came up with was central currency. They made all local monies illegal, and now you had to borrow money at interest from a central treasury. I mean, it's a great way for someone with money to get wealthier simply by lending out money and getting back more than they lent out. But what it does is it puts a growth requirement into the economy itself. Now, in order for a business to exist, in order for it to pay back more than it borrowed, it needs to grow, right? And that's how we got what we call now growth-based capitalism. Companies have to grow in order to meet their debt structure. The economy has to grow by some amount in order for us to consider it healthy. Did the GDP grow or not? The reason why it has to grow is not that growth is a requirement for economic health. It's a requirement for central currency's health, for banking's health. That's how banking actually works. And it was fine, you know, as long as the West was, we were expanding West, as long as there were colonial empires who had more people to take over, you know, more natives to enslave, more resources to extract, it all worked, right? Because it was expanding, it was growing. But as it grew, it had this sort of nasty quality of really disconnecting people from the value they created. So instead of being a value created, you were an employee. And anybody who was creating value on the periphery, like natives in the West Indies who were making rope for the sailors, they would make a new law. Oh, it's illegal to make rope. Only the company is allowed to make rope. This is why we had the revolution in America. The American Revolution against England was not that they were so mad at the king. They were mad at British East India Trading Company. If you grew cotton on a farm, you couldn't fabricate the cotton and sell it. You had to sell the cotton at fixed prices to the corporation. They would ship it all the way back to England, where it was fabricated into fabric or clothes, then shipped all the way back to the colonies where it was sold as clothing. And people were realizing, this isn't really fair. Why is this happening? And it engendered the kind of scorched earth, extractive, non-competitive aspirations of most companies, of, you know, to this day. I mean, that's how Walmart works, or any company that's looking to make money by expanding rather than actually just gaining revenues. And this all really worked right up until really the end of World War II, when colonial nations that had been colonialized or colonized started to push back. And it was one of Eisenhower's, technology advisors, a guy named Vannevar Bush, who said, he was a guy who was in charge of using computers at war. And he said, we could do a kind of a swords to plowshares thing here. These computers that we used for war, we could use them instead to expand markets now that we have no more territory to expand to. He was the first guy to really think virtually. And this is back in the 1950s. So in Eisenhower's time, they came up with computers as much to create a new surface area for growth, for consumption, as anything else. And then the scorched earth extractive policies could continue. I remember the first time I saw that, I was working in a law firm as a typist. Those of us who knew how to do word processing got good money for sitting there all night typing up reports and the depositions of things. And there was this receptionist who I was trying to get enough courage to ask her out. And by the time I finally decided to, she was gone. She'd been replaced by an answering machine. And I thought long and hard. I hated those answering machines ever since, but I think we all hate them because we know, when you sit there going through menus rather than talking to a receptionist, I understand the company that replaced the receptionist, the human receptionist with this menu system, they saved money by doing that. But they cost me and everybody calling them a whole lot of money. So now the only way to keep up, right, is you get a fake receptionist, you get a computer receptionist for your business. So all the businesses do that, but the total amount of time wasted now is greater. So this thing that makes things internally efficient actually just externalizes inefficiency to everybody else. And that's the problem with the way too many companies still think about technology. That's what Google did to its neighborhood. It's what Amazon did to pretty much everyone who tries to work with them. It's what Uber did to its drivers. And it's because they don't understand good old-fashioned basic economics. I read Adam Smith, that all the libertarians were calling Adam Smith their hero. And I encourage them to read Adam Smith because what he said made so much sense to me. He basically said there are three factors of production. There's land, where you actually grow something or get you mine the minerals. There's labor, which are the human beings that are working. And there's the capital, the money that you put in. But in the digital economy, because digital technology loves symbol systems, digital doesn't really understand land, digital doesn't understand labor, digital does understand numbers. And in a digital economy, it's really easy to celebrate capital, to celebrate the venture capitalist who comes in, who gives the money. Now he's in charge. But what about the labor? What about the land? Well, you end up with a technosphere much like the one we have, where we have different technologies that are either exploiting labor, they're polluting the land, they're extracting rare earth metals. It's great to think, oh, here I could drive a Tesla and I'm using electricity instead of gas and I'm not making any pollution. But then you got to pay attention to, well, where did the batteries come from? Where did the rare earth metals come from? Are there kids going into mines? What happens to the car when it's done? Where is it disposed of? And when you look at the end-to-end carbon life cycle of some of these technologies, they're very different than the way they feel. And what we've ended up doing is, and I want to end quickly rather than share all my ideas on where digital business went wrong, so we can have our conversation. But what we've ended up doing is kind of having a reversal between people and technologies, where instead of thinking about how, and this is, it is Nicholas Carr, but it's also Neil Postman, who was looking at how do technological tools, how do our technologies go from being tools to turning us into tools? How do we go from being the programmers of our technologies to being the programmed? We have a smartphone, and we call this a smartphone for a reason, right? It's because every time we swipe the phone, it gets smarter about us as we get dumber about it. The apps and programs on our phone they represent a multi-trillion-dollar industry that's trying to figure out how to play us. And when we were computer hackers, we used to talk about finding exploits. Finding an exploit meant finding a hole in a computer system that you could hack into. Now, digital technologies look for exploits in us. Digital firms, they hire behavioral finance people, behavioral psychologists really, to look at, well, how could we make a person do this? How can we make a person do that? They build algorithms that through trial and error really attempt to figure out how to get us to do one thing or another. And when you look at a technology, and now I guess an obsolete technology like Facebook, and think about how is it really working, what Facebook, all it's really doing is using our keystrokes to assemble data about us, to put us into statistical buckets that can figure out with, say, 80% accuracy, whether you're going to get divorced or get pregnant or go on a diet. And once they know with, say, 80% accuracy that I'm going to go on a diet in the next month or two, what do? Into my news feed, I'll start seeing ads for, diet pills or news stories. Do you look fat today? Or what's going on inside your veins? And the object of the game for them is not simply to sell us what the advertiser is advertising, but to get that 80% accuracy up to 85 or 90%, to, as I was saying in the very beginning, to reduce the possibility and increase the probability of my actions. So what they're doing is taking that 20% of people who were going to do something weird, the 20% of people who were not in the statistical bucket, who were going to do some anomalous, strange, creative, wonderful behavior, and get them to fall in line with their statistical profile. That's a really dangerous thing to do. It's dangerous for businesses to do it to themselves because they reduce their innovative capacity, and we've seen that everywhere. But it's dangerous to do it to a population of people on whom we're depending for new ideas, ways of getting out of our current morass and climate change and everything else. So we end up with a digital landscape where companies really externalize all the costs, all the problems, and think that they can keep growing fast enough to leave that behind. And where it gets truly strangely perverse is when we see our tech billionaires building spaceships and building shelters in New Zealand to literally leave us behind, as if they are conscious that through their actions, they're making the world uninhabitable, yet they also have a plan B for escaping from that and leaving us in the lurch. So we are all, in that sense, we are all those the residents of San Francisco looking at these companies growing up like the skyscrapers in New York City for the sovereign wealth funds to almost extract value and build these empty penthouse apartments where that's where all the money is going. And it's an unacknowledged but very value embedded operating system that most of our digital companies are working on. And I think as they become more aware of it, which is really what I'm seeing my job is to talk to my friends, my wealthy tech friends, and help them understand what's going on, is to point the way towards another way of understanding digital technology and digital business. And no, I don't mean the metaverse, which we can talk about if we want, but I'm talking about thinking about it just the way they do, thinking about the economy like a program. How could you program the economy not just to favor growth, but to favor flow, not to favor the accumulation of capital in a few places, but to favor and to be biased towards the distribution of capital more widely? And I'm not talking about socialism or the kind of the redistribution of capital after the fact. I'm talking about looking at how do we pre-distribute capital before the fact? How do we pre-distribute what are called the means of production? And we're starting to see new forms emerge where workers own the businesses. Instead of platform monopolies like Amazon or Uber, we're seeing platform cooperatives where the workers all own a share of the business that they're operating in. It looks much more like a family business. And they move, rather than being required to grow, all they're required to do is to move to profitability, which a lot of the growing companies still don't have. So how do you end up living in a world, living in an economy where people actually want dividends and revenue? What if we change the tax policy? It sounds easy. Change the tax policy. So instead of rewarding capital gains, which is just passive growth on your stock, what if we reward people? What if we tax payroll low, tax dividends low, tax revenue low, tax circulation low, and passive accumulation should be taxed high? And this is the programmer's mentality, where if we took the digital sensibility, for redesign, for creative destruction, for all the things they talk about, and applied it to our economic value system rather than just the technologies on top of it, we could end up building an economy that serves people instead of really building technologies that serve capital. And that's what I'm interested in working on. That's really what my life's become about. And one way of moving toward that, and this is some of what I talked about with the students that they're really interested in, is how do we recenter human beings in this equation? You know, that's really the beauty of digital. You know, the original, this is what digital refers to really, are these digits, right? That's the digital. And what digital really does, it returns us to production. Instead of being passive spectators of media, we are now producers, we are makers. So we get our hands back on, you know, on the machine, our hand back in it, in a real way where we can participate and build together. And, you know, and as I look around in digital culture, I still see so many companies looking at how do we use technologies to manipulate people, to encourage certain behaviors, even the good ones, even the people that want to fix technology's ills. You know, they talk about humane technology. That's the Center for Humane Technology, to do nice things. When I see humane on something, I think of, like, you know, those eggs that say humanely raised chickens, you know, so they were nice to them as they took their eggs or slaughtered the chickens, you know, and they want to build programs that nudge us, like it'll nudge you to be nice at work, or it'll nudge you, remind you to say something nice to your spouse. You know, that's still thinking about how do we use technology on people. And that's sort of what I want to avoid, is just doing stuff on, working over people, and instead putting people back in the position of autonomy, of the ones who actually have agency. And in order to do that, we don't go back in time. I'm not saying we go back to medieval Europe, but we retrieve some values. We retrieve the pro-human values, the scaled values. We retrieve, we retrieve agriculture. We retrieve culture itself. There's a whole lot. I mean, it was Marshall McLuhan, who said that digital retrieves the medieval. And what he meant by that was it was going to retrieve all those things that got squashed in the first Renaissance with a new Renaissance. And you look back, what was going on in that Renaissance? It was the commons, it was magic, it was peer-to-peer currencies, it was local markets, it was localism, it was women as healers, it was permaculture, agriculture. I mean, the kinds of things that we could bring forward now with the technologies that we have and the insights that we have, the light digital tech, we could really, truly solve our social problems, our political problems, and even our climate problems if we use a little bit of humility as we venture forward into the next phase of this digital renaissance and begin programming for people rather than the programming of people. Okay, that's a half hour from me, probably enough to prime the pump and get our mic fixed. So I want to speak with Taylor Owen. That's who I came for. That, I mean, I don't know if you understand the resource that you have there, and him. He's one of my role models, and especially when I want to begin thinking more rigorously about technology, media, culture, and journalism, and how they all intersect. So he's a great gift.
Well, you were just saying that to soften me up, so I wasn't like difficult on you to begin.
I love difficult. I was born difficult.
So your recounting of the rocks at the Google bus anecdote reminded me that this morning I saw a story about Jeff Bezos's yacht being built in Rotterdam. I don't know if you saw this, but he's building this, one of the biggest sailboat in history. And it's being built in Rotterdam. And in order to get it out of the shipyard, they have to dismantle one of the bridges in Rotterdam to get this thing out.
Do you know this boat is so special and has such big sails that this yacht has a second yacht that travels with it at all times, because the sails are so big, you can't land his helicopter on the yacht itself. So he has a second service yacht with the helipad on it in case he needs to fly away.
Yes, but it gets better. So they need to dismantle this bridge. And the residents of Rotterdam are so upset that this bridge is going to be dismantled that there's a Facebook group going around where thousands of people are signing up to throw eggs at the yacht as it goes under this demolished bridge. So there you go. Your next lead anecdote for the book.
Throwing eggs at the Amazon boat.
Bezos at the Bezos boat or whatever. Yeah.
It is interesting
Right, so
because we both worship and honor these people. You know, I saw CNN and MSNBC going out to the Blue Origin when it flew, and these newscasters were just weak at the knees, talking to Jeff Bezos as if he's the Messiah coming back. And it's like, we've gone to the moon. You know, what are they really so excited about here is that an individual could have his own space program, that a dude had enough money to get to space.
Well, and technology plays into that intimately. I mean, we went to the moon with basically only a calculator, and we're celebrating these guys. So,
yeah.
Look, there's a million things we could talk about, but I kind of want to start on the money stuff you were referencing there. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the policy debates around these problems you just laid out at the moment and how we can fix some of these problems. And I would say that a dominant thread of that now, and sort of the orthodox thinking, is that the business model, as you say, kind of is the root cause of a host of these different social and economic and political and democratic ills that stem from the use of these technologies. And we are in Canada, so we can't not talk about Marshall McLuhan, and when we're talking about media theory. And I'm wondering how much of the media here, sort of these technologies as media, can actually be explained by their economic model. So if we fix these economic problems, if we get those incentives right, if we change the extractive business model, if we limit data collection, if we limit surveillance capitalism, like all those things that you might do to get at that business model, how much is that going to fix the media problem that we have here, which is just that technology is influencing our lives in all these really intimate ways and changing what we are and how we understand the world and how our mind works and all of that?
Yeah, I would say half. We'd solve half of it. You know, I liked to think we were going to solve all of it, and I would have argued that for a while. But it's funny. It's another Timothy Leary anecdote. He's coming back today a lot. I was at his house when he was reading the book Media Lab by Stuart Brand. And it's a book about MIT's, the starting of Nicholas Negroponte's Media Lab. And I remember sitting there and he's reading the whole book in one of those long, lazy Sunday afternoons, and he's writing in it. And I'm thinking he's having this life-changing experience. And when he's done, he throws it across the room and he goes, ugh! I'm like, what? First thing he says is only 3% of the names in the index are women. That's how you know there's a problem. And then he proceeds to explain to me, he said, the guys in the Media Lab, they're trying to recreate the womb. These guys, they weren't, their mothers, he was a psychologist, he goes, their mothers weren't able to anticipate their every need. And now they want to build a bunch of technology so they can sit safely in a womb and have these algorithms and robots bring them everything they need. And they never have to interact with another human being again. And I do think there's that element too, that we are thinking of technology as a way of insulating ourselves from the big bad world, making everything very predictable and safe. And it's never safe. It's not, you know, and it's partly the boys and their toys. You know, it was when it is 97% boys in building these things, you end up with a certain population. So I do think the tech itself can have that bias. That's a temptation with these. And so many of them really are that way. They're replacements for, substitutes for intimacy.
But absolutely. So you'd start with the business model. I mean, that seems clearly where your head is at the moment, that we have to solve for
because at
first,
least in the
and then we can
story
talk
as
about
I
these other-
experienced it, it's like, oh, we were all having a good time. And then it was like, oh, how are you going to make money off this thing?
Yeah.
And then it's like, and I know so many people, even Evan Williams and the Twitter guys, the most of the people I know who have these now evil startups, except Travis Kalanick and Uber, who may have always been kind of horrible. Most of them started out with these really great ideas, even the Google boys. Then in 2001, as Shoshana Zuboff deftly narrated, their investors came back and said, look, you're only making this many $1 billion a year off Google AdSense. Come on, boys, what do you got? And they said, well, what about all this data that we've got lying around? Maybe we can use that. And that's when evil, really came to roost at Google.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and live by the dark market and die by the market. I mean, Facebook reports slightly slowed growth, and they lose 250 billion in market cap. And
now we know, right? The whole Meta thing wasn't just a distraction from congressional hearings. It was also a way to distract us from the fact that their current business model is over. Just like when AOL bought Time Warner, it was because their subscriber base had peaked, in 1999, right before the dot-com bust.
Yeah. So one part of recalibrating the business model may be to move to more sort of cooperative type business models like you've talked about. And I take the point that there's some great examples of that, but why haven't we seen it really take off? I mean, the Uber one surprises me constantly. I mean, how hard would it really be for Uber drivers to use a cooperative app as opposed to Uber? Like, is the network effect just so great of Uber that that's just not feasible? Or like, that seems like relatively easy to me, and yet we haven't really seen it.
Yeah.
So how much hope do you have in that cooperative
model? There's a few good case studies on it. I mean, in Austin, they were pretty successful at creating an alternative. I mean, in Austin's Austin, but they were pretty successful at creating an alternative one. New York, they finally have like a third try at it. The problem is Uber is really powerful. And when another player comes in, Uber does really mean things. Either create certain kinds of regulations that if you're a smaller player, you can't. I mean, regulation, and it's sad, but regulation usually is not a way to curb the bad habits of big corporations, but just to lock in the monopolies of big corporations. So it's
well, it's
really
why Facebook
hard.
supports some regulation, because it'll,
The regulating, it's really fine. But it's partly that, and partly I would say it's still early. I'm starting to see good competitors to Grubhub and Seamless, but it's just the only way to do it is not scaled. The way to do it is to leverage your home field advantage, to say, okay, you're this big national thing, but you're not really here. We are the restaurants of this neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, and this is the app that we use, and to network those apps together rather than to have one big expanding company.
Yeah. So another aspect, I want to talk about where some of these technologies are going. And I think a lot of the model you described sort of a web 2.0 moment or a social web moment where attention and data, the extraction of data and the monetization of data for attention kind of became the primary economic driver of these companies and grew them to the size they are now. But I like you referencing the surface area of economic growth, or surface area for economic activity. And it feels to me that some of this Web3 conversation, however we want to define what that is, and I'm actually frankly very curious to hear you define it, because I'm still struggling to understand what it is. But part of what they're arguing is that individuals and individual activity in media spaces should be a new surface for growth, to use your term. They're saying individual activity, individual production inside these systems should be owned and capitalized by the individual themselves. Is that, do you think, is in some way that's a positive development, or is that just rhetoric from the VCs funding
I don't think it's positive. It's saying, I don't accept the underlying premise that we need to find new ways to grow the economy. It's like saying, oh, we've got to put more of our reality in service of these numbers. It's like, no, and numbers are your freaking problem. They don't have anything to do with the world in which we live. It's just a way of getting more numbers. But I understand. I mean, part of it comes from what you're describing is a little bit like what Jaron Lanier was describing in one of his books, where he was saying, look, everything you do that makes data is something that you should be paid for. And anything you do could be made data. So I start imagining this sort of nightmare where everything I do is data. So if I get out of my bed, the way I get out of my bed is data that's worth something to the mattress company. So then I start thinking, well, the way I get out of bed if I change it up in certain ways, if I
Mm.
if I get out of bed on the left side 3 days a week and on the right side those two, and then go to this way and then do that, I can get more sense per bed leaving. So I start optimizing my whole life into how do I maximize the anomaly of my data to make it more interesting to the algorithms, and then I'll get paid more. It's like, what's happening? And I mean, so that's part of it. But for me, what Web3 is a way of trying to go literally to go meta. And that's what business has done for a long time. You know, you start with land, you call land property, and now you've gone sort of meta on, then you have a mortgage on the property, you've gone meta on property. Now you have a basket of mortgages, you've gone meta on that, a derivative on the mortgages, or a credit default swap on the derivatives. So you keep going meta to the point where everything is a derivative on some piece of reality. And each derivative in theory has more surface than the original. But you
And
end
the
up
surface on which capital can be.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Which is why you ended up with, you know, the New York Stock Exchange, which was already an abstraction of the market, ended up consumed by its own derivatives exchange. You know, the ITEX bought 9X. So it was consumed by its own abstraction. You know, and that's, I think, what, you know, Meta, when Mark Zuckerberg's saying is, well, Meta is going to matter more than reality. It's like, no, there's still reality here, I think.
So there is, and I want to push you on that a little bit too. I mean, so I have an 8-year-old, and he has started, much to his parents' chagrin, playing Roblox and Minecraft, particularly through the pandemic.
Those are the healthy ones.
And so they are, right? Yeah. But I'm convinced that they are normalizing a generation to the metaverse. I mean, he now assumes that a digital space, that the internet or a screen, needs to be a social experience and a place in which he can build. He can socialize and he can build. And probably eventually have some sort of commercial activity, because he sees that that's embedded in these systems too. And the flip side of that is there's some meaningful interactions that happen in these spaces. You can just see it. It's like there's friends, and he visits relatives in it, and they're meaningful. So do you think the metaverse could actually kind of narrow that gap between the real physical and the superficial virtual, or could we actually be human in your term of being human in these virtual worlds?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think about the first virtual world that we created was probably spoken language. And I think about what it must have been like to transition from a non-speaking world into one where now there's all these things people say, you know, and then you made mouth noises and that person then moved over there. What did you do? What kind of magic was that? Well, there's this realm of speech, you know, that actually matters to us, you know, and it could be as big as that, right? It could be as big as that. And if it is, then I think all that really matters is that we bring our full selves and our full attention to the constitution of this realm, where all we're really bringing to it now is it profitable? You know, is it profitable? And I'm not like some crazy Marxist person, but I almost want to ask the other question. What is it other than profitable? Or could we make it non-profitable? Could we make it non-extractive? What would that be like? So but virtual reality, Web3, decentralized tech, blockchain are all kind of different things. And when people are saying decentralized web or Web3, they're kind of throwing it all together. And I realize they can work together, but the thing you're talking about, and I understand, is this. So he'll be in Minecraft minting NFT creatures in this world that can get bought by other people. And, it's like, I see how these technologies could work together to create a different sort of economy. But if we did, I wouldn't want it to be an economy that has to also deliver exponential returns to its architects.
Which is, it was almost for sure what's going to happen here. Although
Then it
there are
won't
people
work.
calling for kind of public virtual spaces and building things like the equivalent to public parks or public schools or playgrounds inside these virtual spaces, which I think has potentially some promise, right? Because you could get all that, the human capacity of them without having to fully commoditize them.
Right. And there's a few good people, you know, Eli Pariser's really looking into that now, into building, I forgot what he called civic. I was on there involved with them at the beginning, kind of looking at how do we create civic spaces in these new online environments.
Yeah. So I want to bring some questions in from
please.
the group here soon. And then, like, one of them is, it's going to be hard to avoid a Spotify Joe Rogan question at the moment. And so someone's asking just sort of what you broadly think about what's going on there. And I wonder if I can kind of reframe that or add to that a little bit, that I'm wondering how you reflect on the state of journalism in the context of that. I mean, Rogan often gets compared to his audience compared to CNN's audience or to Fox News's audience or to the New York Times readership. And is that the right kind of comparison we should be making for someone like that who clearly has a huge impact?
No, I mean, I can't give I don't have a great sense of the numbers, but I was on Joe Rogan in the early days, you know, before he was as controversial, I guess. He was a nice enough guy, and we talked about weird stuff. It reminded me more of, there was a late night American broadcaster named Art Bell, who used to have this show about like flying saucers and, you know, chupacabra. And it was like X-Files sort of talking. It was all night. It was called Coast to Coast. It was this, it's still around, I think, with the guy who replaced him. And you could call what he did as dangerous as what Joe Rogan was doing, because it was like he just listened to everybody about every crazy thing and every conspiracy, and people would come on who said, yes, my mind is being controlled by a government radar thing, and all these people would call up, oh, my mind's being controlled by one too, and you know, and I think I get concerned that the piling on Joe Rogan is overprotecting us from a non-threat. It's making it a bigger deal than it is. That here's a guy who's a relatively innocent but non-critical dude who enjoys hearing weird stuff, you know, and as long as people, which they don't, as long as people understand that this is just weird stuff, it'd be fine. But it doesn't look to me any more dangerous than what American Idol did to American democracy, leading people to think that this is how you vote, or that their votes actually were counted. There's a disclaimer at the end of the show. It says, we don't have to take any here. We're allowed to pick whoever we want. Producers reserve the right. You know, or that The Apprentice was real. You know, it's the sometimes it's weird. I feel like the left went into fictional television, like The West Wing, to have this fantasy of democracy in the midst of what was an awful administration. And the right went into reality TV as its playground. And now reality TV has kind of shifted over and become reality. But the left is still off in Netflix land.
Yeah, and look, that's partly why I think Trump was so skillful at using things like Facebook, because he saw them as a central place for this kind of conversation, where the left was stuck in kind of an old media universe and kind of a romanticized vision of what political speech was going to be. But in that vein, there's a question here about the state of liberal democracy. And I mean, I guess, how concerned are you about some of the decline in reliable information and the lack of signals of reliability we're seeing in our ecosystem at the moment? And I mean, frankly, some of this Joe Rogan problem is related to questioning of authority and undermining of legitimate institutions. And is that how much does that concern you at the moment?
A lot. I mean, what keeps me up at night is the concern that I was naive to think that John Dewey was right and Walter Lippmann was wrong. That I've had so much faith in the capacity of the so-called masses to understand what's going on, to be to live up to the tremendous responsibility of living in a democracy. And I had, it was weird, it was years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I had lunch in this expensive place in New York City with a former Secretary of State of the US. And he said to me, "So Rushkoff, you finally accept that democracy is a failed experiment." And it kind of broke my heart to see someone of that power and experience say something like that. And we were just talking about Fox News and all. And I was sort of thinking, maybe he was right. And, or at least maybe for some, maybe some of us are not up to that challenge. And that I feel like we need to operate on more than one level. We need to operate honestly as journalists and politicians and communicate the real truth about what's going on. But we also need to do it in such a way that people who are not really ready for the truth have a story that they can relate to, that can encourage them to behave responsibly.
Yeah, I mean, that's a nice way of framing it. And it seems that part of the challenge that journalism faced, or big J journalism, is that they bought into that economic model of big tech as well. And they kind of went all in. They absolved all of their economic activity and their relationship with their audience and their distribution, and they just moved it all onto these platforms. And we kind of saw how that worked out. But I wonder if we're seeing a bit of a new model emerge here in funding of kind of big J journalism, with the subscription models that are emerging, the Substack world that's emerging, that's actually paying journalists in kind of a fairly meaningful way. I think, whether it scales or not, I don't know. But how do you look when you look at the landscape of journalism now, kind of big J journalism? How do you assess its viability and future?
Well, I feel like the healthiest things going on are like ProPublica and these sort of networks, these nonprofit networks of journalists, global networks. They're almost based on the AP model, except, a little bit more specialized. I'm really interested in them and them uncovering stories that then they can sell to these newspapers who've adopted some of the sillier models. But some of them are pushing through to the other side. The Guardian is a really interesting case of they kind of made it through to the other side of something. They survived with a kind of a hybrid model. I mean, I know what you mean about the majors. The New York Times is a real estate operation. You own a giant building in Times Square. It's a different thing. When your news operation is no longer your primary revenue source, it's really tricky to be a newspaper at that point. And certainly the cable news channels were truly hacked by their own business models, pretty easily by candidates who could create the most uproar. So even though they're not digital to speak of, they're in the digital media environment at this point. So, sensationalism rules. But no, I do think there's something, there's new shoots, Substack will be interesting to me when we start seeing Substack teams, when people when it's less individual, like, the New York Times wouldn't let me print what I was going to say, so I'm taking my ball and going over to Substack. You can find me there, and then you find your own audience of angry people and you get that feedback loop with them. When we start seeing people who are willing to work together and then see a group of 10 journalists hire an editor who they're going to listen to and that build it up, like
what does that start to look
artists.
like, frankly? I mean, 10 journalists working together under the banner of an editor bundled in one fee. I mean, that starts to look like a traditional media company pretty quickly again.
Right, but it came from the bottom up, and maybe, you know,
Yeah.
it will have a different sense. But I have a feeling that's probably the way magazines started way back in the day, you know.
Mhm.
And every once in a while, I mean, when I was in college, that's the way it would be. A group of
Yeah.
kids get together, let's do a literary magazine.
So we have a question here about AI and kind of the exponential growth we're starting to see in that spaces. And how do you view that intersection of machine learning and the leveraging of these data, largely that have been collected from the very companies and platforms that you're describing, building something new off of those? Is that, how do you view that evolving?
I mean, there's so many kinds and approaches.
Mm.
I think it's dangerous to build into AI its own incentive to grow exponentially. In other words, if the prime command, if the prime directive of all these little AIs out there is to grow exponentially by any means necessary, and to use those humans to get what you need, it doesn't look pretty to me on the other side. You know, the machine learning replacement of humans, that doesn't even bother me so much if it's jobs we don't want to do. I'm more than happy to sit in a lawn chair drinking iced tea while the robots till the soil, if they can till it in a responsible fashion. You know, if they can actually you do the right things, that's fine. I'll find meaningful things to do, even if it's not called work, even if it's not a job. So I'm not worried about that whole replacement thing. Doesn't bother me. But and there's always something to do. There's always someone to care for. There's always someone to read to, or feed, or nurse, or something. But it's just what we task them. And this weird, you know, the conflux of behavioral economics with machine learning, with AI, doesn't sit well with me. And that's really the camps that I see playing together.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's where this ultimately becomes a media question, I guess. But on the the robotics and the human augmentation side, I mean, it is interesting that Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, the two richest people in the world, are both actively developing technologies to try and augment the mind. I mean, and to embed their other technologies into the mind, or to communicate with the mind. And I do wonder what that's going to mean to our conversation about what it means to be human, frankly.
Yeah, although, I mean, I've always found that the better simulations get, the better humans get at distinguishing between simulation and reality. You know, people used to, back when movies were first around, black and white movies of a train coming toward the screen would make people run out of the theater because they think they're going to get run over. And no one would do that now. So I feel like, I don't know, I don't, everyone tells me, everyone involved in simulation tells me, in 10 years, it's always been in 10 years, since like 1992, in 10 years, we're going to have simulations that are indistinguishable from reality. Or in 10 years, we're going to have AIs that pass the Turing test. And I'm like, if a robot passes the Turing test, it's not testament to the robot's brilliance. It's testament to our lowering standards for what it means to be human.
Yeah, fair enough. So you're saying you'll line up for the Neuralink chip to
No, leave me
the early
alone.
trials of it?
Leave me alone. I don't even like, I got these, I got them up there, the Oculus Rift thing I put on that makes me nauseous. I don't like anything. But I've always been sensitive, you know, it's like the belt, the belt on my pants like digs into me. It's like anything. And digital even worse. So no, I don't want that. I don't want that. And partly because I feel like these digital, so far, digital still doesn't do anything between the 1 and the 0. It still resolves everything to 1 or a 0, to one of those click places. I feel like digital technology is being used to auto-tune our reality to official notes on the spectrum. And auto-tuning is the problem. You know, think about, what if you auto-tuned James Brown right? James Brown reaching up for the note or coming down in over the note. It's that part between the notes of James Brown. That's soul. That's what we mean by soul. And that's his soul. We are trying to auto-tune human soul out of the equation. And that's the part that bothers me. And I don't believe these devices get the in-between, the soft, squishy, fuzzy, unnameable, unknowable. There's stuff that even though language is great, not everything could be expressed in language. James Joyce tried. Even in between, you can't get it all in there. So we're not going to get it all on an interface either. There's a human experience that's different and ineffable and unknowable. And I don't need to be spiritual to believe that computers live on the ticks of the clock, and we live in that space between the ticks that they don't even know about, which is as if we're in a different dimension from them entirely. And I don't want to discount our dimension too fast before we even know what the heck is going on here.
Yeah. So there's another number of questions coming up around how we might govern some of these questions, and what sort of this policy debate might look like. And a number around particularly the algorithmic side of this. And I mean, we know that some of these attention algorithms are driving a lot of these harms we're talking about, or these outcomes we're talking about. And I'm curious whether you see any promising sort of interventions in that space.
In the regulation of these things?
Yeah. Like, do we have any hope in regulating algorithmic systems that even the people who build them don't particularly understand very well and are deploying on mass publics in these experimental ways? I mean, is there really any hope in intervening from a regulatory standpoint?
I always wondered that, I even wondered that when I look at, genetic engineering and cloning and weaponry and, and then if we don't do it to some person in some other country where they're not regulating, you just go there and do it. One of the main motivations apparently for seasteading, for building these little nations out in the ocean, is so that they can go do whatever tech they want to do in an unregulated way. And if Peter Thiel and the billionaires are going to go do it, then they're going to go do it. So no, I don't think there's a way to stop it. I don't, and it's certainly concerning. The only thing that'll stop it, is probably the market not liking it for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly not impossible. And again, back with some of those market interventions might actually be our most, market regulations, frankly, might be some of the most effective.
Right. Usually.
What's remarkable is, I mean, the U.S. has been pretty hands-off in regulating these companies, but that could change, frankly. I mean, the U.S. Is nothing if not serious about the value of markets. And if markets are seen as not being fully functional, there's a long history of America stepping in, the government stepping in and correcting for market concentration. And with the current FTC, it's not impossible. We see that now. That could have a bigger effect than all sorts of regulatory steps happening in Europe, for example.
Right. This weird, a seemingly minor unintended consequence to Wall Street can end up. Yeah. And I guess I agree that if these things do end up regulated to our benefit, it won't be for that reason, it'll be for some other reason. But, there is, just as a great Marxist will always argue that there's the market has these systemic effects and all these things happen that serve the market. Well, humanity has systemic effects too, and I do think regulation could happen. Read Carlotta Perez is really good on this, and she looks at industrial revolutions throughout history, and they're right after this period of rapid growth, there's almost always a return to regulation, one way or the other, either fascistic regulation or democratic regulation. It's just hard to imagine now when we don't even have a functional government in America. They don't do anything, but agencies can still sort of do certain things.
Yeah, I mean, there's still a fair amount of regulatory power in the FTC, I guess, if they really
Yeah.
want to do something. But so another question here about digital literacy, and this is something I often struggle with, and I think it's many of our digital literacy initiatives tend to be about how to make people fact check information that they see in their stream or take personal responsibility for their online behavior. And I'm wondering how you think that's always seen sort of a limited vision of what digital literacy could be to me, particularly when we exist in these much more complicated systems than just ones that are derived from our own human individual agency. How do you view digital literacy? Is there a broader way we can think about it than how we often do it in schools?
I guess, I mean, it's funny, digital literacy is itself kind of an oxymoron, right? Because we're talking literacy is what you need in a literal world, digital, fluency, competency. Fluency is for language, literacy is for reading, right? So it's not about reading the media anymore with digital. It's about, digital, is it agency? Is it autonomy? Is it intention? So the skill in a digital age is not authorship or writing or reading, it's programming. It really is. It's digital is different in that you set something in motion and then it keeps going. You code something that then lives on, whether it's nano or robotic or genetic or programmatic or algorithmic. It keeps going. So digital literacy is almost, I think it has something to do with understanding cybernetic systems, understanding how things feed back, and being able to do what McLuhan would call the pattern recognition that you need in order to see how things spin out when they keep going. So you're not reading static things anymore. You're looking at systemic effects. And obviously, as we're able to do that, then we'll see how people like, Bezos or Musk, how these people will be literally hoisted on their own petard, is the way we used to say. There's feedback loops. You create enough algorithmic trading and you're going to get GameStop and meme stocks. It comes back. You reap what you sow, and you really do see it in a digital environment in a very different way because of these feedback loops. So I think it's going to change. I think it's pattern recognition is what we're talking about here, is the true digital literacy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another question here about sort of the way mainstream culture or media, whether it be movies or books or television shows now, seem to be romanticizing things like detaching from the big city and moving to small towns and rural life and the analog. And you made a pretty strong case for exactly that in Team Human, of stepping away from technologies in some meaningful ways in order to regain something.
Right.
And so do you think we're actually seeing that now? And maybe has the pandemic, even like Team Human came before the pandemic.
Yeah.
Has that sped things up a little bit now in the direction that you were?
It sped things up in both ways. I mean, people are on Zoom and online and doing that more than ever before. And the danger is to think that you have to disengage entirely or move out of the city and go to your eco farm and, in the woods and live on a lake. I mean, there's not enough resources for everybody to have their own eco farm. It's not going to work. Just moving uses so much more energy. You can be human pretty much wherever you are, right? It's a lot of it has to do with your approach and the way you spend your time. So if you can decide, I'm going to prioritize my sleep rather than binging the third episode of this Netflix show. Binging on Netflix is an algorithm. Netflix shows are pretty much created by algorithm. Netflix is like Cheetos. It's like programmed empty calories just to keep you passing these styrofoam crunchy things through your system. I mean, yeah, if you gosh, remember watching TV intentionally. Oh, I want to see this thing tonight. Occasionally there are like Succession. It's going to come on Sunday, whatever, and I'm going to go watch Succession, and that's it.
Mm.
And then have the discipline to not, before the thing runs out, and then they know what they're doing. They really do. I get you. Watch one more, just one more. And it's 2 a.m. and you're going to teach at 9. You don't get sleep. What have you done? You've worked for the man. So being team human is just taking back charge and somehow valuing your sleep or your touch or your food or your wife more than, being on one more, this stuff, another screen, another trade, one more crypto trade, and I'm going to get on a token that's on a new Web 5 blockchain thing, no fuel. If I stay up till 4, I'll pay less fuel charges. It's okay. I'm minting NFTs, Mom. Leave me alone.
What do you make? I mean, we have to close here, but you never gave me your sort of articulation of what you think this Web3 thing really is, and how you define what's going on here. And how do you explain why we're suddenly hearing about this? And if it seems like these waves of technologies come in sort of multi-year shifts where new economic models emerge, and I think you've described the first 2 of them with the first version of the internet and then Web 2. And are we really in that big transition now? And is that where we should be paying attention, or is it a bit of a distraction?
Honestly, Web 3 is Napster, right? Web 3 is Tor networks. Web 3 was that. That's what it was, and then now there's these things called blockchains, which can allow you to do pretty good privacy key encryption and stack them up into a ledger. Cool. But no, it's not web. The hype, I would argue, the hype around Web 3 is the crypto investment community's need to pump some life into something, into a massive amount of money that has not yet found a utility. And Web 3 is their way of saying it's a wrapper, it's a name around the as yet to be invented reasons for this thing. And Mark Zuckerberg showed you can get a fencing lesson from an Olympic person. You can have a meeting with little bottomless torsos. You can make clothes for other people's avatars, and they can say that they own it, even though anyone else can wear it. They can be the official person. They can have a tag on it that says it's them. Yeah. So I'm not there. I'm not there. And then there's some people saying that this is going to restore democracy. I was at a conference that says it's building a blockchain-based social network to enable multiracial global democracy. With a
I heard
blockchain.
I was at an event recently.
I didn't know it, but it turns out that was the only thing standing in the way of human beings and universal social justice.
Yeah, I heard it
A
was
ledger.
DAOs recently, that DAOs were going to save our sort of
DAO, right? The DAO,
crisis.
DAO of DAO. That's the book we should write together. Let's do it.
Right. All right. I think that's probably a good note to end on. I mean, look, we went in a million different directions there, like always, but thank you so much for this. That was a fun conversation.
Thank you.
So everybody, please join me in thanking Douglas Rushkoff for doing what literally only he can do, taking us on that whirlwind tour of everything from the ideology of the internet to the future of the blockchain. And thank you, of course, to Phil Lind for making this all possible. Phil, I hope to see you again in person soon. And a big thank you to the staff members who made this all happen. Becca, Lindsay, Tina, Carol, all at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And not And last but not least, thanks to everybody for joining. We had a big crowd here, and I know everybody's getting sick of these virtual things, but it was wonderful to see everybody here. We hope you enjoyed this event. As was mentioned at the beginning, it's the first of this year's Lind Initiative series on the future of media, and it's a pretty remarkable group that they've compiled this year. Soledad O'Brien, who I'm a huge fan of, Matt Tybee, Kara Swisher, and Ed Young in the weeks to come. So thank you, everybody. We look forward to seeing you at the next event on March 3rd with Soledad O'Brien. Thanks so much. See you soon.